We'll give our attendees some time to filter in too.
Mm. Mhm.
Afternoon, everyone who's joining us. We'll start in just 1 minute. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you are in the world, which is the magic of Zoom. I want to thank you all for joining us for this wonderful panel, which is entitled Researching Behind the Veil, Scholarship and New Perspectives, which is a part of our two-part series on Behind the Veil at 30, Reflections on Chronicling African-American Life in the Jim Crow South. This two-day conference has been sort of a part of the public programming for a wonderful digitization grant that we're working on here at Duke University and the libraries to digitize an archive entitled Behind the Veil. And for those who are uninitiated, Behind the Veil was an oral history project that took place here at Duke University in the early 1990s that was sponsored by the Center for Documentary Studies. And it deployed graduate students here at Duke and at neighboring institutions throughout about 20 locales in the American South. And the intention was to gather the stories of African Americans who lived through the Jim Crow era and remained in the South during that time. And as we learned yesterday, one of the questions that was sort of prescient in the minds of uh, the faculty members that coordinated the grant was, what happened before the civil rights movement, right? So what happens before the 1960s and 1970s moment, and what were the lives of African Americans like? And so reaching out to community elders from all walks of life and capturing the diversity of African American life during that time period, the archive or the oral history project grew to a little over 1,000 interviews and includes close to 2,000 photographic slide images. And so in 2021, we were, the libraries was granted funding from the National Endowment for Humanities, which is also co-sponsoring this event along with the Center for Documentary Studies, to digitize the Behind the Veil archive. And so that work is currently underway, and we will be launching the project records and the project archive in 2024. So this event is really an opportunity to both look back, but also look ahead to the kinds of stories that Behind the Veil has told and can tell us. And so this specific panel this afternoon will be focused a little bit on some of the new perspectives and the scholarship that has been most recently done by some amazing scholars who I've had the good fortune of working with and through the Franklin Research Center. And so for those who are with us and have questions, we're going to ask that as we go along this afternoon for roughly 90 minutes or so, that you please use the Q&A box to drop a question in or a comment if you've heard something that sort of moved you to want to ask a little bit more. And we have our wonderful Behind the Veil outreach intern, Brianna Magruder, who has been working diligently to coordinate our our conference who will be reading off the Q&A once we get to that part. So without further ado, again, welcome and thank you for attending. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone on the panel, which I don't think I introduced myself. So let me start with me. I'm John Gartrell, and I serve as the director of the John Hope Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture and the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. And my role is to serve as curator for our African and African American collections here, of which, as I mentioned earlier, Behind the Veil is one of them and one of our more popular archives in the Franklin Research Center. And I'm joined this afternoon by Dr. Beatrice J. Adams, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the College of Worcester, Dr. Candace Watts Smith, who's an associate professor of political science at Duke University, and Cecilia Zhu, who's a PhD candidate at the Department of Afro-American Studies at University of Massachusetts Amherst. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And so just to kind of lead off, I wonder if we could kind of go around the boxes here and we'll start with, we'll go reverse alphabetical order. So Cecile, I'll start with you. I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction of yourself, your research interests, and your discipline.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm in Afro-American Studies department. My work is mostly historical, so I do women's history, but I also am interested in Black feminist thought, conflict theory, and history of sexuality and power. I do mostly late 19th and 20th century history. Yeah, that's what I do. Behind the Veil is at the core of my dissertation, which looks at the impact of sexual violence from white men on Black women during Jim Crow as a weapon of terror. And that's what I do. Yeah.
All right. I'm looking forward to digging more into that. Candace, why don't you go ahead?
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I am a faculty member here at Duke in the Department of Political Science, and also interim vice provost for undergraduate education. And my research, when I have my research hat on, I focus on Black politics with a kind of special focus on ethnic diversity and what that means for the shape of Black politics, as well as trends due to generational cohort change. So, what are millennials and Gen Xers doing that are different, things like that. I study American racial attitudes, and that's a political scientist's way of saying that I study white Americans' racial ideologies and racism. And then the final bucket, I would say, is in social policy and inequality. So how does, why, I guess maybe the question at the center there is, why does politics and how does politics get in the way of good policy? Thanks for the invitation, John.
Or Beatrice.
I want to start by saying thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here and talk about this project that's really at the center of my dissertation and now my book in progress. So my research is about the American South in the 20th century. I'm interested in why African Americans stay in the South and return to the South during the Great Migration and how that's connected to the emergence of the new Great Migration. So the kind of mass return of African Americans to the South in wake of the Civil Rights Movement. So I'm interested in the kind of connection between race and region and the ways that's shaped also by class, gender, sexuality as well.
So I guess to kind of kick us off and getting into, and you all have talked a little bit about your connections with Behind the Veil, but Beatrice, I wonder if you could go ahead and unmute and talk a little bit about how you first encountered Behind the Veil and what your initial impressions were.
So when I was preparing for this, I was like, how did I first hear about Behind the Veil? And I went back in my own personal archive of files to figure out this story. And I thought I knew about it when I was applying to grad school, but I don't think I did. And I think I just Googled it. When I first got to grad school, everyone was talking about the archives they were going to be using for their dissertation. And I was like, oh, I should be talking about the archives I should be using for my dissertation. And I want to say that I Googled like Jim Crow oral histories, and this vast collection came up. And I think my first impression, both when I Googled it for the first time, was vastness. And when I sat down in Duke's archive for the first time and began to actually look at the collection, my first impression was just how vast, how much it shows all the kind of diverse texture of African-American life during the Jim Crow period. But after I heard about the collection, somebody in grad school definitely told me you could apply to Duke for a library research fund. I applied, and that's the first time I was able to come to Duke and really look at the collection and realize like, oh, this can really be the kind of core set of primary sources I used to write my dissertation.
Thank you. And I remember us talking in the reading room when you arrived for the travel grant, and you being really, really excited about going through and getting your work done here. So Cecile, same question. How did you first encounter Behind the Veil?
I think it's very similar to Beatrice in a way, because same, I came to grad school from France. So grad school was really a vast question mark. I didn't know nothing, but when I got here, a lot of people were talking about primary sources and what they were going to use. And I knew I wanted to do oral histories because I was very interested in vocabularies and how certain topics are discussed in oral histories. And so, yeah, I Googled it as well, and I found it was just so vast. It was just so many that I was like, there must be something that I'm going to find there. And so then I came, and I think it was one interview that I remember of Mrs. Mary Getter in Georgia. And it was just so complex and so much going on that was so linked to what I wanted to talk about that I was like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna come back here and actually go through all of these. And so, yeah.
And Candace, same question.
So I went to graduate school at Duke, but in political science, and I left for a long time, and now I'm back. And one of the things that, when you show up and people are sweet talking you to, come, John Aldridge, who is a friend and a mentor to me, and also a friend of Bill Chafe, reached out and said, look, we have this Bass Connections project. So Bass Connections here at Duke is kind of like we might think about it almost like as a multi-generational research setup where you have faculty, you have graduate students, and then you have undergraduates who are all focused on developing research projects. And this Bass Connections theme was on racial politics in the New South. And so John told me that one of the reasons why he even went to graduate school was because of this book called New Negroes in the South by Matthews and Prothero. And he wanted to replicate this book, which was written in the late 1960s, to see, what are the changes, what are the trends, what's the same concerning questions of Black politics and racial politics in the South. And so one of the components of the project, we were hoping to use the Behind the Veil interviews to kind of mark like an early point, and then think about how we can come up with a new study that will help us to look at trends from the oral history with the survey data that we were collecting and that we are collecting actually now among the states of the former Confederacy. So I got introduced through the Bass Connections project, through John Aldridge, and through this effort to track and trace trends in Black politics in southern states.
So Candace, I'm going to ask you to unmute because I'm going to lobby the next question back to you that because I wonder if you could say a little bit more about using the collection to engage in that research within your discipline and maybe even your own personal research interests. And I'll also say that I feel like most people that come to the archive are historians. And so as a political scientist, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, what is the different way, or maybe the political science way that you've approached it that maybe a historian likely wouldn't? Because political science is not my bag. So go for it.
Okay, yeah, it's totally my bag. So I'll carry it here. So I was trained as a quantitative social scientist. And so what we were trying to do is maybe backward engineer the interviews to create a survey-like set of responses. So usually in political science and survey data, there's some series of questions that you might have, how old are you? Where are you from? What's your attitude about the extent to which your life is influenced by other Black people's well-being? To what extent have you experienced discrimination at the workplace, whatever? And then people can answer like a lot, a little, some, like that. I mean, this is a kind of typical way that we would do this. And so because there are so many, I'll say this also, in current political science, to get a survey of 1,000 people would cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so here we're thinking, okay, we have like this huge data. Can we backward engineer the interviews as if they were being asked survey questions? Okay. So obviously, the design of the interviews were not created for that. And we learned that the hard way because we are not historians. That is not our bag. And so we really, actually, the fact of the matter is that we failed at doing that, but that's okay because we learned a lot from it. And I'm happy to discuss the things that we learned, but ultimately, we were just trying to think about how to use the data in a new way. And what we ascertained is that we can't use it for that, but there are many other kinds of new ways that we might think about using the data. And the students who were involved, I think that we have all experienced failure in research, but those are learning opportunities. And so we enjoyed our fail because we got to read so many of the interviews and start to think really creatively about what we could do next with the work and the archive.
Okay, we're going to come back to the lessons learned in just a minute. So Beatrice, same question in terms of engaging with your research interests and how you used it within your discipline.
So I'm a historian. That's my bag. So I'm going to tell a story, right? We always want to tell a story. So I was surprised that I hadn't encountered it before grad school, because when I was applying to grad school, I went and did a master's in Chicago. Chicago's very cold. So when I was thinking about where I was going to apply to grad school, for a number of reasons, right? The Samuel Proctor Project, Paul Ortiz, but also because Florida is warm. University of Florida was like towards the top of my list of places to apply. I went there, I met with Paul, I met with many of the researchers, the kind of grad students working in the Samuel Proctor Project program. And I didn't end up going to the University of Florida. I ended up going to Rutgers, but I had this kind of connection to the university already. And when it came time to have an outside reader, I asked Paul Ortiz to be my outside reader. So I had this kind of connection through Paul to the project even before I went to grad school. So I think that's why I was surprised that I wasn't talking about it yet, but you don't know what you don't know. But that kind of scholarly connection has been really useful as I was developing my dissertation, just thinking about it as a proposal, and then across kind of doing the research and writing. Some of the people who are prominently featured come from Tuskegee. Paul was involved in the Tuskegee project and kind of could tell me which places to look for oral histories that might talk about return. If you're interested in things around like work culture or agricultural history, here's some of the places where you should kind of look at oral histories to do that work. So just having that kind of intergenerational scholarly connection was extremely useful. And yesterday, as part of the conversation, there was actually one of the questions was about the children, people featured in the collection. And I'm working on a book project that's a collection of oral histories about Tuskegee and kind of the civil rights generation of students who come of age in the South, thinking about their experiences and also what happens to them post-civil rights movement. And some of their parents are actually featured in the Behind the Veil collection. So there's kind of this generational connection as well. So Detroit Lee's son is one of the people who oral history is in the collection, as well as Della Sellen's son, some of the Hootens, some of the Quins. So I also have this kind of intergenerational connection. So it's really shaped me as an oral historian, and an oral historian who's not always collecting the oral histories, right? So in that process, this new project, I am kind of lending support, but a lot of the oral histories is done by one of the people that was also on the ground. So I think it's been a kind of lesson in not only what does it mean to collect oral histories, but what does it kind of mean to be maybe sometimes a step removed or a couple of steps, or sometimes just from the archival perspective and not in that kind of oral history space, and how to still make use of them, which I think is one of the topics we'll probably explore some more. But it's definitely shaped my dissertation, my own research, as well as my other kind of scholarly endeavors.
Thank you. And Cecile, same question.
It really shaped a lot of the dissertation and where and my interests in interdisciplinary work. I think the oral history really made me realize how much the theoretical underpinnings like that I was interested in were really important, because so I came to the archive not knowing if I was going to actually find what I was looking for, because basically I wanted to look at sexual violence between Reconstruction and the civil rights movement, because there's a gap in like focusing on that aspect of the reality, because we have with Recy Taylor, we start again in the 40s, but there's really this gap in between. And I just couldn't believe that it stopped, you know? And so I started listening, and it was just really impressive what I learned, because you have women across states that, because I was looking at Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia. And so you have women across those 3 states that mention. So that's the thing, sexual violence is everywhere, but it's also nowhere, because nobody ever said rape, nobody ever said sexual assault. It's had a baby for, or, you know, oh, they just worked in the house. And you have, so that's what I'm saying, is women across those states that tell me, oh, well, yeah, it was known, it was a light-skinned town because there was Black women living in those houses of white people, and then they had their families, and then they also had children. And it was just this reality of these women just mentioning those towns like Grand Mary in Louisiana, or I think it was a Jacksonville in Georgia. And I had never heard about it. And the fact that it was just such common knowledge, it told me that I wasn't mistaken, that it was there. It was just so much there that it's not even talked about anymore, because that's the atmosphere that we're in. And so that was one of I've just learned so much, and it was just so intricate too. And now I'm like, I have even more to learn because I didn't look at the pictures. And now that we're talking about light-skinned towns, and we're talking about yesterday, I think it was Dr. Mitchell that said that she walked in, because I think she was mentioned in an interview by Mrs. de Villiers that I really was interested in too, but that she walked in for an interview and that the woman was African descendant and she didn't recognize that. And I'm like, I have to look at those images now because there are so much conversations about colorism that they're having in the interviews. And it's just, yeah, it just gives so much that you have to not engage everything, but it's just, yeah, I think it's so it just has so much to offer.
So actually, Cecile, I'm going to stay with you because my next question was about, doing the research in the archive, whether or not it confirmed what you were looking for or not. And and you just talked a little bit about how your specific topic, which I want to say excited about, not excited from the standpoint of that it happened, but excited from the standpoint of like, here's someone who's really interested in this. I too was curious when you first got in contact with me as to whether or not this was discussed, because I know from just my own sort of dealings with the oral histories that the kinds of questions that were being asked there were no direct questions about sexual assault, right? In most cases. And so I'm wondering what it was like for you to actually be sitting there and listening, because you and I talked a little bit about how you have to unpack the language a little bit. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think for all of us, but I think for me, because of what I was looking at, sometimes I had to, take a break because what I'm looking for, and it's a weird relationship you have to the archive where you're looking for an unfortunate event. You're looking for the unfortunate. So it's kind of, yeah, when you find something, you're like, oh my God, but at the same time, it's really, and because it's oral histories and because it's tapes and we hear them, it's not just reading. For me, it was really, I feel like I was getting to know the women that I was listening to. And so the vocabularies that they used it varied across states, but it also varied when we're in women that were born in the 1910s and then women that were born in the 1940s, because I was spanning from 1890 up until 1940s. And so I had to rethink how we talk about sexual violence, and how it can show without, because again, yeah, I remember having this conversation with you and you being like, it might be, I can't tell you that it is. And then and that's also the truth of the archive. There's days on end that you're in the archive and you're not finding what you're looking for, but you're still learning so much, but you're still not finding, and it's days and days. It could be what is the word? I don't know in English, but it can be a hard process, but at the same time, it's also, I learned so much. And because I also wanted to really tie the research with Black feminist thought, I felt like I learned so much from their experiential knowledge and from these women's generational knowledge that they were discussing from their mothers, then their grandmothers, and about learning how to live this Jim Crow South. Yeah, I don't know if I really answered your question.
No, I think it's fine. You could also say it in French if it doesn't come up in English. It's fine.
Okay.
So Beatrice, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the collection either confirmed or changed your initial research project, and how so.
Before I kind of directly answer that, I do want to say a bit about kind of finding violence in the archive. So when I was proposing what I was going to write about, almost the professors I would talk to, graduate students, just whoever, I think what they imagined was this kind of spectacular incidents of like Jim Crow violence. So why would someone stay? And I got a lot of questions. So in some ways, I almost came into the archive looking for violence as well, right? I was looking for that to kind of fundamentally shape oral history after oral history after oral history. And when I didn't find that, I had to really think through my own kind of assumptions about what life looked like for African Americans growing up in the Jim Crow South. My father was born in the Jim Crow South. He's born in Arkansas in the 1950s. And when I hear him talk about stories of coming of age in the Jim Crow South, or my aunts and my uncles, like that's not the way they tell their life narratives either. So it made me kind of reckon with some of the kind of implicit assumptions I had about violence and how it shaped everyday life and how people talked about that violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if they're not talking about it in this kind of spectacular ways we imagine it, what are the kind of assumptions I'm bringing to the archive? And it took me kind of years to work that out and kind of be okay with what I actually did find. But I think the one major implicit idea that I stepped into the archive with was about people staying, was that people stay in place, right? If somebody's born in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, they grow up in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, they go to school in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, they die in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not at all what I found. I found people being born in like unincorporated parts of the county and moving to somewhere like Cotton Plant, Arkansas, or people being, you know, from Alabama and moving to Kentucky to work in the coal mines, or people moving into Birmingham. Like I just found that movement was very ubiquitous, despite the fact that they might not be leaving the region. And all my own implicit biases in my question, right? When I imagine people staying, I imagine just that, people staying. But people within the South are constantly using mobility as a way to pursue freedom, opportunity, success, whatever. They're just not leaving the region. So that initial kind of, I think relatively early in my notes that I'm taking at Duke, I'm like, oh, people are moving around constantly, question mark, right? Like, what does that mean? To the book project, when like inter-South migratory networks is like a fundamental part of the first half of the book. And now when I introduce myself and talk about my project, like inter-South migration is a key aspect, but that really evolved from looking at the interviews and seeing that, oh yeah, all these people stayed in the South, but very few of these people, quote unquote, stayed in place. They're moving a lot too.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you were also looking at the sort of the relatives that move north and then kind of come back, or like what were you able to glean from the interviews in that respect?
I think part of what I kind of use to think about people moving back and forth is this idea called habitual return, which one day maybe I'll have an article out about it. I've been working on it. I don't even want to say how long. But even people who move north come back a lot, right? And people have very clear impressions of what the North is like because there's this kind of constant flow of people and information in a way. And sometimes the encounters are very sharp, right? They say like, have you paid the taxes on the land that you left down south? Or do you own any property? Or and sometimes they're more genial, right? People are writing from up north and asking them to send them like fruit and clothes and all these things. So, but this feedback loop of information, I think challenges one of the assumptions we have about why people stay. So people stay in migration theory is like almost stasis, like it's almost unthinking. But people thought a lot about the North and had all these connections to the North and had relatives in the North who came and visited and they exchanged goods. So I think this idea that people would stay in the South almost as an unthinking decision, or because they're so poor, or because they're beat down, or all these kind of assumptions sometimes we have about people who stay, actually are really challenged in the archive. People who stay in the South is usually very much a thinking decision and say things like, the South was home, or I don't like the North, or, you know, they have very clear ideas about their decision to stay, in part because of these very clear familial, communal, and even firsthand experiences they have with the North.
Okay, I'm going to stop because I have a follow-up question, and I'm going to filibuster for a moment because I'm going to ask you all. This is off script from the questions that I sent out beforehand. If there's a particular interview that you want to share with our audience that really stands out to you. So that's me filibustering while y'all think about it. And I'm going to ask Candace to get into what you said, how you came to the archive looking for that quantitative data and you failed. So could you say, I don't mean that callously, I mean it like
It was a
as
fail.
as an intellectual endeavor, sometimes we need to fail in order to shift and move
Yeah.
to something else. So please tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is I think as we were kind of thinking through, like, okay, some of the questions across the interviews are about the same, but many are different. And then we got to looking at like, okay, wait, who did the interview? And this is how I learned actually that a very good friend of mine was one of the interviewers that, in my normal way of doing work, I don't look to see who collected a survey. I just don't. That doesn't matter. But in this case, it does. And so then we start thinking through like, okay, like the team intended to have multiracial teams, but from a political science perspective, we have a thing called race of interviewer effect. And so we were thinking like, oh, what does that mean that, what happened? Like when, these two graduate students knocked on a door and one of them was white, like what is our expectations for how that interview might have been shaped, right? That's something that we know in political science and just try to think through what that might mean. And then also like to Beatrice's point, we, in quantitative social science, we think a lot about respondent bias and selection bias. So we're thinking like, okay, what is it about people who elected, right? People have choice and agency. Why did people stay in the South? And, to Beatrice's point, they could have moved from one place to another place, but why the South? Is there something different about this group than people who elected to go elsewhere and stay elsewhere? And so, are these people, are the people in this sample have a particular worldview? Do they have a particular set of community base? Are they particularly strategic? Have they managed some sort of, are they more likely to have managed some sort of status that would have allowed them to navigate some of the issues? Or what does it tell us about segregation? So even in just kind of thinking about, well, what is it about, how can we use the tools of political science and the tools of social science and quantitative social science to think systematically about the data? And so it just on some level was kind of a pedagogical gift to just kind of stop and think through like, well, what is the shape of the data as it exists? Because it's not what we thought it was going to be. There's one other thing that Cecile said earlier that I was like, oh. Actually, I think I can kind of answer the question that you're filibustering. One, and because I am not a historian, I don't, you all are very good at names and places. So I didn't mark the name and place, but this one interview was of a man talking about how he was really excited to go to his first day of school. And he had gotten dressed for the day. He looked really nice. He had on his school clothes and he was getting ready to go. And the man who owned the land that his family was sharecropping on saw him and, was like, where are you going? And so he's, going to school, and the sharecropper, the owner of the land said, no, like you're not going to school. You're going to stay here. Okay, that stood out to me as a story, but also for my students to think through some of the stereotypes that they have learned about people's values and hear how we see a kind of see in action the ways in which people were prevented from living out their values, and not necessarily by the state, but by people who were probably endorsed tacitly by the state. And so and I just bring this, I just keep using this word over, as a quantitative social scientist, what I sometimes want is for people to see the data. on average, this group is like this and this group is like this. The median experience is X, Y, and Z. And we can tell those numbers, but people don't get it until they see the story. And so I think for me, and like you, historians know this already, right? But like people who are in my area, you're like, an anecdote is not data, right? And so sometimes you feel like you can't, we're not supposed to value the anecdote or the narrative, but it's the anecdote and the narrative that helps people to connect really what the statistics are trying to tell you. And so that was one of the stories, one of the interviews that our little group read, and it really kind of stuck out as allowing students to connect the structural inequalities that they can think about in the abstract, with the kind of everyday way that it played out.
So I wonder if you could actually share more about some of the things that your students took away with them, or some of the conversations that you were having with the students in terms of, because I imagine they had likely never heard oral histories or listened to the voices of African Americans during this specific time period. So what was their reaction to listening to the interviews?
Yeah, I mean, they are a group mostly of political science majors. So when we send, our curriculum here, you have to learn R. R is a statistical package. It's kind of complicated. And, I think the language is that of numbers and math. And you miss out on the history and context when you go down that path early in your career. And so just kind of to come back from that and to listen to what people are saying their experiences are, I think was particularly, it impressed upon them that it impressed upon them that real people experience the things that we have put in numbers. Mm-hmm. Numbers can have a way of kind of blurring over individual experiences and emotion. And so on some level, I think it really helped to remind them the reason that we study racial inequality is because it seems like it's a weird disconnect, but you can say, the US is the most incarcerated, one of the most incarcerated countries in the world. There are 2 million people who are incarcerated. And then you learn about, yeah, you get that. But to hear about maybe how someone was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and ended up in that system that we talk about 2 million people. So I think one of the things that I think it helped my students is really to just kind of remember that the numbers represent individual stories, and to appreciate history. I mean, just to appreciate history in the way that we sometimes kind of forget, because we have fancy models that can tell us how thousands of people feel, or their preferences, or their experiences. On average, we lose the nuance and the complexity of the human experience.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So Beatrice or Cecile, you want to jump in with interviews that really stuck out for either of you? Is there a name that rings a bell?
Okay. I can go first. One person who I always think of is Ann S. Porter. So she's in the Tuskegee Project. And at this point, when I was looking through the interviews, I was really interested in people who weren't middle class, right? Especially in Tuskegee, that can be a bit of a struggle. But her family experiences racial violence. She talks about it. She talks about coming of age in Tuskegee and how there was class politics and class dynamics that made it very challenging. And how she kind of at certain points wanted her parents to leave, to migrate away, but they stayed because I thought it would be the best place for her educationally. And all her kind of parents' hopes and dreams for her come true, right? So she works a series of different jobs. She's a sharecropper, she's a domestic servant, but she eventually gets a federal job in Tuskegee and kind of retires from this federal job. So all these kind of struggles that sacrifices several generations of her family made, moving to Tuskegee to escape racial violence, staying in Tuskegee despite experiencing kind of these harsh realities when it came to class, all of them kind of come to fruition through her, right? And when I was preparing for my job talk, I thought, I really want to find pictures of some of these people that I write about. And I think it was part of some kind of study syllabus, maybe, that at some point had been put together with people from the project. And I found pictures of her and the home that she grew up in. And it made me, having listened to her talk about when her father is incarcerated and they were already kind of poor and struggling, which is part of the reason why he was incarcerated. To see the kind of home they were living in when all of this happened, it kind of brought me to tears. So I always think about Annis Porter, and I'm working on this Tuskegee project now, and I'm always like, I wonder if I can find some of her relatives or something like that. And then I should probably stop because there's just so many that
No, keep going. Give me another one. I'm happy to, we'll take it.
There's someone from Arkansas. So my family's from Arkansas, and his name is Thomas Malone. And he's probably one of the first people I discovered who wrote explicitly about why he didn't move north. And he says that he comes to Chicago, which is where he goes to St. Louis and he runs into some classmates of his, and they didn't even speak. And they were just acting like city folk. And that's how I knew that they moved up in the north and ruined them. Right. And just the cadence, like the North has ruined somebody, really stuck with me. It became like, oh, like this project might actually work out. I might actually find people who are writing explicitly about what does it mean to stay in the South, and also how the South becomes very associated with manners and values and morals in a particular way that shapes people's migratory decisions. But I should stop there because I can just keep going on and on and on. But yeah, the North didn't ruin you is very doable for me.
It's this heel.
Well, but that's funny that you say that, because my story is it's still Mrs. Mary Getter from Georgia, because it's so much in it. But the fact that, first of all of her grandparents had a white father, just that. And the fact that every time there's a conversation about having white in ancestry, it's always a man. And then she's discussing her marriage, and she's basically explaining that her husband had issues with drinking that stemmed from really deep mental health issues, because he was mistreated as a child because his mother had been assaulted by a white man, and he was the child of this. And then he had a stepdad that felt some type of way about him because he was lighter than his brother and sister, and because he wasn't his child, and because of what he embodied. And so he was mistreated as a child, and that impacted the way he was a husband to Mrs. Getter. And so we see how it impacted her family, and then how it impacted her husband. And then she's having a conversation because she had her mom really mad at her because there was a man that, when she was in her teen years, there was this white insurance salesman that used to just walk in the house like he was invited. And Mary Getter had told him more than one time, you don't do that. You knock when you go to people's places. It's not like that. But her mom was deeply afraid, and her scare was embodied by, you don't say nothing. You don't want to get in trouble. And then one day she really told him about himself, and she told her husband, And her husband then went to see this white man. And so her mom was like, you could get him killed. Like, look, you went north and now you come back and you think that you can say those things and do those things, but you can actually get your husband killed. And so then we also have the conversation of it all, the women's experiences, they put themselves in the background and they're discussing a lot of the men's experiences around them is what I was also hearing, because often, even when they were discussing those light-skinned towns, it was like, and you know, they had husbands at home and it was sad for the husbands, but we're not discussing the mental health of the woman that is like going through that. But so yeah, I think that this story was very impactful, but I also wanted to, because I'm writing chapter 5 right now. And in chapter 5 is the 1940s, and I have the narrative of Mrs. Pearlie Aloy. And in it, she's discussing at the beginning, she's saying that talking about this oral history reminded her of her aunt's funeral when people were sharing joyous times about her aunt. And the interviewer asks her, like, were you talking about segregation? And she's like, no, this is a funeral. We didn't talk about segregation. And then she said, the whole issue of Jim Crow has nothing to do with something that we caused. It has to do with what other people caused and how they perpetuated it. And so we're not going to spend the energy talking about that we had no control over. And I think that a lot of times that was something also that I really discovered in the oral histories, that there was a real sense of life within the community was great. And there was such a community feel. Everybody was like, there was one like that you could go to your neighbor. I heard a lot in their words sometimes, the longing for the community feel of the time that they felt that the children of the children were not experiencing. And that was very interesting also to consider, because they're still recognizing that was a terrible time in certain aspects, but it doesn't encompass their whole lives. Their whole lives were so much fuller. So yeah.
Thank you all. I really appreciate that. You know, it's interesting to just kind of put an interview on and just sort of let it roll. And I remember listening to an oral history from Durham, and I'm blanking on the name at the moment. And they were just talking about how you couldn't go to certain stores down in downtown Durham because you couldn't try on the clothes, basically. And to Candace's point, that's something that we all have heard more than likely. If you think about Jim Crow and what segregation is on paper, but like to hear the voices of these people and their lived experiences, to your point, Candace, with your students, right? It changes the dynamic of the numbers on the page to, oh no, like this is actually how it felt or how it looked. And the ability for each person that's on record with sharing their story to kind of transport you back into this time is something that I marvel at every time I get a chance to listen to an interview or two. So I have one last question for us, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So I'll encourage you all in the audience to think about questions that you might want to drop in the Q&A box. So you all talked a little bit about the vastness of the collection and just how large it is. And so I wonder if you have any advice for new researchers who might explore this large this large collection of oral histories, and what you might advise them on in terms of where to get started or how to approach it. So I'll open it up to whoever wants to start with that question.
I'll start because I think I probably have the least helpful advice, which is, I mean, so for me, I think that, so if I were going to tell another political scientist, I mean, the thing is political science has kind of gone on this road to be more like economics. And when it does that, it misses out on the complexity and intricacy of human behavior, which is, I mean, on the one hand is what we're trying to study. We try to dumb it, we try to like flatten it so much that we miss out on the richness. But even as Cecile and Beatrice were talking, I was thinking, oh, that would be a cool way to use the data, like for something that I would be curious on. So like Beatrice, you were talking about thinking about return migration. And I was thinking about Sabrina Prendergast, who is a sociologist, and like how might her current interviewees in Charlotte, for example, or Durham mirror or not mirror the people who were in Behind the Veil, for example. Or like Cecile was talking about colorism, and increasingly, you know, scholars are trying to think through how to measure attitudes toward colorism, and actually perhaps looking at the kind of historical record about how people talked about it, we might be able to come up with better questions, how to operationalize these attitudes that, you know, people are feeling like it's like new. It's not new. People have been talking about it for a long time. And what are the ways that they, what words do they use? How do they, it's not, you know, to what degree do people see it as a positive thing or a negative thing, right? We might think about how we can operationalize current current ways to measure using historical ways of speaking and talking. The other thing I would say is that I hope increasingly people are noticing the ways in which your local politics influences your life. We tend to kind of like think that Congress and the president does everything, but so much of education, policing, healthcare, especially like reproductive healthcare and rights, these are all dictated at the state and local level. And there are, the data has these great, subsets of cities. And so, you know, if someone was really interested in a particular place, it would be really phenomenal to focus on by location, and think about, for me, like as a person who studies contemporary politics, again, what are those trends? How do we see people talking, thinking about a particular issue, in one era, and how are they thinking and talking about it now, given that they are connected by the geography? So, in our failure, we really have kind of thought about like, okay, well, we couldn't do it for this, but how could we use the data for, the kind of work that we do? And these are some of the things that came up. And then of course there's like, I almost forgot your question, John, but oh, I know what it was now. The other thing that I wanted to say is like, I think it would be really cool. And I just want to put this out there, John, we talked about this briefly.
Sure.
I would love for someone to do like a podcast using the interviews. But I'm not going to throw myself or yourself under the bus on that. But, yeah, I think maybe, just kind of, there are so many ways to use the archive, and for people who are, across disciplines, I think that there's space for, there's just so much richness there that that I can think of many people across disciplines using the data now.
Cecile?
Sure. Advice for, I think, not to get overwhelmed by the vastness, because I think I was a little overwhelmed at the beginning, because I was like, I mean, it's so many localities, so many states, and just, I didn't know where to begin and where to end. And so sometimes the archive is going to tell you. So I would say, honestly, just let the oral histories tell you what they're telling you and then go from there. I think that that's what the conclusion has been for me, really, that I can have expectations, but as yesterday they were discussing, you might have a question, but they're going to go where they want to go. So they're going to tell you what they want to tell you, and you're going to learn what they wanted you to learn. So yeah, I think to be open to all the possibilities that the archives offer.
So I guess I'll start by saying my suggestions and then my own hopes for how to use
Sure.
the project moving forward. So I would say, think explicitly. I think we've been having this conversation about language, explicitly about the types of keywords that you're going to be putting, right? It's all digitized now. Is it going to be keyword searchable? Think very explicitly about the types of keywords you're going to use, because your assumptions about what might generate the best searches probably aren't actually true, right? That's putting rape and sexual assault in, or even migration in, aren't going to get you the results that you want. So I would say, think explicitly about that process, do a little like kind of test run, and then go back. So research and research again, and keep revisiting those as you're going through the results. But I would also caution you to slow down, right? Before we started, we were talking about how you can almost see the shadows of certain researchers and the types of questions they ask. Looking at kind of place-based, you can kind of see the differences between researchers as they ask different questions of different people in different places. So I would encourage you in this moment, as the project in some ways is becoming so much more accessible, kind of slow down. Like when I had to go to and look at the go to the archive and look at it, right? And get to know the kind of texture of African-American life in the Jim Crow South in a kind of nuanced way, as the other researchers are saying, because it'll inspire you to move in all these new directions that you didn't plan to. I didn't plan on really writing a lot about agricultural history, but the interviews led me to understand that's like essential, which maybe looking back on it seems quite obvious now. But without really spending time and sitting with the interviews, I don't think I would have gotten there. So even as I encourage you to kind of do the best research methods to make the most out of the project, also don't take time to dwell kind of with the interviewers and the interviewees, kind of have this moment to sit with them and read the oral histories in their totality, or listen to the oral histories in their totality, and really slow down and peruse. My hopes for my future use of the project is I'm so excited to delve into the pictures. The pictures I've kind of known that they were there, but it seemed really overwhelming and confusing. So I've only thought maybe like in fleeting moments about the pictures. So I'm so excited for them to be digitized. I'm excited to use them in my classroom, to share them with my family even, as well as maybe some of them, I don't know what the process is. Maybe some of them will end up in the book, fingers crossed, toes crossed, eyes crossed. But I'm so excited to delve into that part of the project myself, and both for my own research, but also for my teaching.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I'm going to ask our outreach intern, Brianna, to come on and cue us up with some questions from the audience.
We have some questions waiting. So let me be the first to say thank you, Beatrice, Cecile, Candace, and John, for that wonderful second day of panel. I know that I very much enjoyed hearing your perspectives on how you'll use the collection, how you're continuing to use the collection for research purposes. The first question that we have is from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, first of all, thanks so much for your fascinating research, and can you talk more about whether you're reading transcripts or listening to the audio, or both? If both, what do you learn from listening versus reading transcripts?
I can go. So I was listening to the tapes as much as possible. Yeah, I think there wasn't transcripts for all of the tapes. I don't know if there are now. Are there?
So there will be.
Right.
There will be.
So right. And the ones that we had were also kind of, I think it did say on the transcript not to it's not official transcript, or like that, you know, it hasn't been, I guess, approved for a certain format. But I really appreciated the listening to the tapes. That was really, because the tone and the silences, and you hear people in the background and what's going on in the house, and it's very rich. And I don't think I would have gotten so, I don't know. I think it brings a lot to have the tapes. Sometimes, yeah, it was, you know, the 90s and tape recorders and stuff. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to hear. That's part of it. But I think it's great to have both, so that if you're not sure that because sometimes, because of outside noises, you're not sure that you can understand, to have the transcripts as a backup is, I think it's great that it's going to be there. But I would say my primary would be the oral first.
I've done some of both. So I think I've used some oral histories where I'm not sure. So first of all, the cassettes, using the cassettes, that, talking about overwhelming. The pictures were overwhelming, but also using the cassettes. So I've listened to some of them that have been available online already, previous to this new digitation kind of initiative. So I've listened to them and looked at the transcripts, but I've also just looked at transcripts for some people. So I'm really excited to hear their voice for the first time, thinking about the future ways that I will use the project. There are people that I feel like I've gotten to know quite well, but I've never actually heard their voice. So I look forward to maybe listening to them and thinking about some of the differences you hear from, I was talking about this oral history that kind of was one of the first ones I found where someone, it struck me about what they were saying about staying. I think part of what struck me, hearing it verbally, I don't know if it would have jumped off the page in some way. Sometimes when people say, I don't like the North, or I stayed because, those really jump off the page. But when people make less clear statements, when they really jump to my ear, is when I'm listening to it. So I would sometimes follow the transcript along and listen at the same time. And I think listening is so kind of fundamental to perusing, because you can just listen and send an email, right? Like, this oral history is important. I think I got what I really need from it, but I'm going to listen to all of it, and I'll send a couple emails and I'll do whatever, but I'm going to listen to it in their entirety. And it really helps with that kind of like learning the texture of the archive, is just sitting it with it and listening to it. Yeah.
So go ahead, Candace.
No, I have nothing to add here. I mean, Cecile really kind of, I mean, both put like nailed it right there. Is we did both. We read it because we were looking for text, because we were hoping to search. And so, you know, we wanted to get a feel for what what reading it would mean for the analysis, but we would often listen to them, not for leisure, but like it felt leisurely to let someone tell you their story, instead of, you could let go. And I don't know. I mean, from our perspective, you just kind of, you could let go in a different way, and just let someone tell you what their, you know, what life was like for them. And so just kind of again, for me, one of the lessons is about the emotion and the human behind the story, and the listening did more work in that area than the reading did.
Absolutely.
And just to kind of add a little bit of context, part of the objectives of the grant is to have transcriptions for all the interviews. So when the archive initially came to the Rubenstein, we had roughly about 1,100 or so interviews, and about a third of those were transcribed by paper, like we had Word documents. And so the intentions of the grant work is to complete transcription for all of them. And it's essentially required when we create digital collections now to have transcription for accessibility purposes. So it's really a win-win from the standpoint of now you'll also be able to read along as you listen as well.
Yeah. And I wanted to mirror the sentiment that everyone brought up, which is that I think when you work in archives for a while, it can be a bit isolating working with so many disembodied artifacts. So getting to listen to someone's embodied voice can be really powerful. Our next question is from Shayna, and it is directed towards Cecile. And the question is, I am also interested in vocabulary and how certain topics are discussed in Behind the Veil. I am currently working with the collection for my master's practicum at UNC, and part of this process is finding linguistic markers that signify when someone is speaking explicitly about the Jim Crow laws in effect. There is so much coded language and an understandable hesitancy to discuss trauma. Could you talk more on your process with building vocabularies that relate to your research themes?
Absolutely. So that's something that we discussed very early on when I was starting to be in the archive with John, because it became evident from the beginning that the keywords for sexual violence were not going to be the ones to look for. But I think it helped me to read other histories of Black women at the time. So for example, a lot of my research was starting off of Darlene Clark Hines' essay about rape in the inner lives of Black women in the Middle West. And so in there, she's theorizing about dissemblance. And so there's a vocabulary that is associated with a certain with this idea of dissemblance and respectability politics of the time that I knew were likely to frame how women were going to discuss certain topics, especially topics like that one, which, I mean, we haven't talked about that, but to me, it was crazy that one of the interviews, the woman is discussing in very vague ways, like, oh yeah, this white man was known to like little Black girls. And you just have little snippets like that. And then she's like, yeah, don't record this. And also there's some of the tapes that have those clauses of, I don't want this to be available in the state of Georgia. Why in 1994, this is the kind of thing that also the archive gave me, that I realized like it's a history, but it's also very present. It's their life right now. And so I think, yeah, to go back to the initial question, which was building the vocabularies, I think maybe reading literature from the time, and when I mean literature, like how Black women and men writers were writing about it, and also maybe media. I've been reading like Black press organs different from the time that can help you see the way that, yeah, the topic at play that for you, the laws of Jim Crow were expressed at the time, I would say.
Candace or Beatrice, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I would also say that if you find an oral history that's doing what you want it to do, right? It's talking about the laws of Jim Crow, kind of get the language from that oral history, right? Once you actually find one that's talking about Jim Crow laws, I can think of one that I use. This is not necessarily Jim Crow law, but like the disproportionate effect of like New Deal in the South for Jim Crow people. And they kept talking about checks, but they're talking about the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the checks that are coming to the landowners. But I wouldn't necessarily think checks is going to get me to New Deal, right? But once I found somebody talking about that, I'm like, oh, if I want New Deal, I can put in checks and then that'll get me. So I'm thinking that once you find an oral history that is useful, think about the words they're using and use those words to kind of help you think through the language.
All right. On to the next question, which is from an anonymous attendee. This person asks, what have you learned from the BTV collection that shapes the methods you've used when doing your own interviews?
I'm a numbers lady.
I guess I'll go. I think hearing yesterday that they had the independence and freedom to kind of shape the interviews themselves makes so much sense, because one thing I learned is flexibility, right? And this is I think something oral historians, the first time I took oral history class, I was an undergrad, and I think one of the points was be flexible, right? But you still come up with a very like strict list of things you want to ask them in order. And the same, right? I used to work at a social science research lab, and like you really do answer, you know, like you really want them to answer the questions in order the way that you have them written. But I think one thing that looking at oral histories for my dissertation helped me to learn is that you really should be flexible, and that it's a conversation, and that people are kind of inviting you into their intimate space in a particular type of way. So to be flexible, I think, and to kind of come in, not as I did as an undergrad, with like 20 questions, very strict. I want them answered in this order. But now when I walk into oral histories, I usually have like a rough outline. Like, let me make sure I get the actual kind of biographical data that'll be useful. But besides kind of big themes and topics, I usually just have like a bullet point, talk about coming of age in, etc., and let the conversation really guide itself. So it's helped me to feel comfortable and confident enough to be very flexible. Yeah.
Yeah, I think flexibility, I so agree. And I would say also ethics and like ethical approaching the people whose lives we're learning about as people, really. And I think one interview I really related, and yesterday seeing scholars talk about them as graduate students just being teleported in Mississippi to go and talk, even though it was more organized and in teams, but you know, there was an interview in which the lady at the end is kind of, she feels like she wasn't told exactly what was going to be asked of her, and so she feels like she didn't really give what she wanted, what the interviewer asked, and she's like, you know, I'm just telling you straight like it is. If you're gonna want to know that, I need you to tell me that. You don't want to do that to people. And it was just so, I don't know, it was such a outside of the historical setting, just a reminder of, yeah, it's people's lives, and it's people who, as Beatrice's research showed, like they have descendants that are here. And so I think it has made me much more mindful of ethically telling stories of other people. I think is a touchy thing, and it has to, and a lot of care has to come with it. And so I think that, yeah, you can tell that the collection is full of care. And I think I was trying to come to the archive with as much care as I could as well. And yeah.
So I'll throw in a little bit of perspective from the archivist's perspective, and my answer is going to be a little bit more about, is a little more structural. So what's really helpful for archivists is to have wonderful release forms. We are fortunate that this collection did implement release forms, but as I'm sure you can imagine, in the early 1990s, when they were conducting the interviews, there was no language about what it looks like to transfer the recordings from a cassette tape to the internet, because the internet did not exist, at least not in the way that we understand it now. And so terms like future technologies are really vital and important, because who knows, one day in oral history that you are doing now might be virtual reality or a hologram or whatever is cool in 2156 or whatever. And there's going to be some poor archivist that's going to look at the release form and go, I don't know if we can actually update this. So that is that has less to do with the actual execution of like the questions being asked, but it is of vital importance to have those kinds of releases, because there are many oral histories from say the 70s and 80s when oral history practice was not as not quite as structured as it is now, where people, you know, had their recorders and sat in front of folks and captured their stories, and the questions, the ethical questions, the questions of accessibility, the questions of uh, evolving technologies are all things that if they end up in an archive, someone will have to answer to. And so that's just sort of a more of an administrative answer to the question, but an important one nonetheless.
Yeah, I agree. And thinking about synthesizing everything that the three of you have presented, I'm wondering if at any time in your research projects, if you've had to kind of mediate your relationship to the institutions that you work for. And I'm thinking back to the conversations from yesterday when some of the interviewers during their time as graduate students were rejected from potential interviewees because the interviewee did not like their connection to Duke or Carolina. So I'm curious to know how you all kind of mediate that relationship when you're working with stakeholders outside of the institution.
Several of the oral history projects I've been involved with lately have actually been like institutional histories. So very clearly like the institution moving into the community. I was on a big research project as a graduate student. So hearing them yesterday talking about like kind of what it meant to be graduate students, like producing research in a community was interesting, because I did Scarlet and Black, which is this big research project about slavery and the experiences of Black students at Rutgers. So kind of, you walk out into the community asking for oral histories very much with like Rutgers written across your forehead, because they know that they're coming to talk to you about Rutgers. Even if they're a community member and talking about civil rights in Newark, you're obviously wanting them to talk about its connection to Rutgers. So I was listening to them talk about the ways in which they were trying not to wear class on their sleeves, and thinking about the ways in which me wearing this kind of institution on my sleeve may or may not have affected those oral histories. But even now at the College of Worcester, the local NAACP is doing this project with the college, right? To collect oral histories of African-American stakeholders in the community. But then again, like, it's very much about the institution. But it makes me think about what we're not capturing, because the institution and the class politics and the economic politics of all of that is so deeply knit into how we're even framing the project. So it actually makes me question maybe how I'm thinking about and framing projects as opposed to the actual interview space in a way.
Come on, Candace or Cecile, I know you have something to say.
I
There we
don't
go.
know that I don't know that I can answer, or maybe what I thought about was taking into consideration. I think I would initially, when I came to the archive, I wasn't necessarily asking the questions that were touched upon yesterday, but the comfortability level and the kind of the relationship that starts when the interview starts between the interviewer and interviewee, and how much that's gonna kind of impact how this is gonna go and what is told and what is not told. And I think I had to rethink and realize they knew it. This is a Duke group coming to ask them questions, and they're responding. They're deciding. They're very intentional about what they're disclosing or what they're not. And that, I think, to always take, and that's not to say not to trust the word that is said, but to take with it's coming with a subjectivity, what is told to me. And I think that really, I needed to get into that. And yeah, the fact that they're not talking to their granddaughter on the porch, or are they, because that in that interview, this relationship was built. It's just such subjectivity. And yeah, I don't know if that's really answering the question.
I think so. Thank
And
you.
I'll transition us towards the end here, but I think one of the things that stood out in our conversation yesterday was the work, and the shout out to the work that was done by Annie Volk and Leslie Brown and a few others who went out into the communities to identify who are the people that you need to sign off from for you to even step foot into this place, right? And sometimes I think, especially when you do social histories, you walk into a community assuming, oh, well, the person in the front of the room is the person I need to talk to, when in reality, it's usually a woman who's all the way in the back who knows everybody, right? And so it's the unseen people work, that, and knowing that you need to sign off and knowing that you don't have all the answers. And you have to lean on those people because you're entrusting them, they're entrusting you with their stories. And they also mentioned yesterday how it was really important for them to share with the people they were talking to that copies of those interviews were going to stay in the community. So while Duke has the full archive of the project, the locales that the interviews took place, whether it be Tuskegee or LaFleur County, Mississippi, or I'm thinking of some other places, in Georgia, that copies were placed strategically in local institutions, whether it was an HBCU library or a local library. And that meant as much to the people that were sharing their stories, because it wasn't just, oh, we're going to capture your story and then take it all to Durham and lock it away forever, but that there would be a copy available in the community, because they were sharing as much of their lives as they were the communities that raised them, and understanding how important that story is to those particular places was a vital part of the work of Behind the Veil, that it's as much a community story or a local story, as Candace mentioned, as it is a personal story, or as all of you have sort of talked a little bit about that and sharing uh, what you learned from the archive. So unless anybody else wants to get in a last word, I'm going to end this there and thank everyone for coming along with us for the last 90 minutes or so and engaging in this conversation on scholarship and new perspectives from the Behind the Veil collection. And thank you all for being with us both days, for those of you that were. And I've learned so much about the project and how much work went into it and what has been learned from it. And I see Cecile, you want to make a comment?
I just wanted to thank you very, very deeply because you've influenced my life, because you've influenced my approach to this archive you're such an invaluable part of this work. And thank you so much for making it available to us. And thank you to the ones that made it possible, but thank you for continuing to uphold those legacies, because this is amazing. Thank you.
Well, I definitely got a shout out all of my colleagues here in the Rubenstein Library, the folks that do the processing work, the folks that make it available in the reading room that you all have been inside of. And sometimes I'm like the face of things, but there's an army of folks that work here that do wonderful, great work to make sure that collections like this are accessible. And so I think on that measure, for a collection that's been in the Rubenstein Library for close to 30 years now, what my biggest takeaway is that I'm looking forward to the next 30 years and the next 30 years and the next 30 years of the scholarship that can be built on this really, really rich archive. So I will sign off from there. Thank you all for coming and enjoy the rest of your day.